Steven's teenage years also introduced him to drugs. Marijuana was one of the reasons he was expelled from Roosevelt High School in 1967. Eventually, he completed his education elsewhere, but by then music had already become his real education. He was writing songs and developing a voice that would eventually become one of the most recognizable sounds in rock. One of those early songs was Dream On. At the time, nobody could have predicted what that song would eventually become. Steven was still a young man, writing about dreams, time, ambition, and the fear that everything we love can disappear. Years later, those words would sound almost autobiographical. In 1969, Steven encountered Joe Perry and Tom Hamilton in New Hampshire. Perry was playing guitar, and Steven immediately recognized something in him. It wasn't perfection. It was fire. It was fire, the kind of raw musical instinct that cannot be taught. Soon, Steven, Joe Perry, Tom Hamilton, Joey Kramer, and later Brad Whitford came together. Aerosmith was born. The young musicians lived together. Rehearsed Cotha tragedy of Steven Tyler is not simply that his voice became weaker. The deeper tragedy is that, for most of his life, the man behind that legendary voice was fighting battles that no stadium audience could see. We remember the scarves wrapped around the microphone, the wild clothes, the impossible energy, the scream that seemed capable of shaking an entire arena. We remember Aerosmith as one of the greatest rock bands in history, and Steven Tyler as one of rock's most recognizable frontmen. But behind all that noise was a complicated human being whose life was filled with extraordinary success. Addiction, broken relationships, health problems, family struggles, and painful controversies. The world saw the performer. Very few people saw the man trying to survive behind the performance, Steven Fichter. Tallarico was born on March 26, 1948, in Manhattan, New York. Music was not simply something he discovered later in life. It was already part of his family. His father, Victor Tallarico, was a classically trained musician and teacher, and music surrounded Steven from childhood. Piano lessons began when he was very young, and his family expected discipline, education, and a respectable future. But Steven heard something different in his head. While his father belonged to the world of classical music, Steven was increasingly fascinated by the explosive sound of rock and roll. He didn't want to sit quietly behind a piano. He wanted to stand in front of thousands of people and make them feel something. As a teenager, Steven discovered that music could give him something ordinary life could not: freedom. He became interested in drums, vocals, rhythm, and the new generation of rock musicians changing America. In the mid-1960s, he formed his first band, initially known as The Strangers and later renamed Chain Reaction. They played small venues and opened for established acts. The crowds were not enormous, and the money was not impressive. But something important was happening. Every time Steven stepped onto a stage, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Off stage, he often felt different. On stage, he controlled the rhythm, the energy, and eventually the entire room. That emotional connection to performance would remain with him for the rest of his life. Shared meals, struggled financially, and dreamed about becoming something bigger than anyone around them could imagine. They were young, hungry, broke, and completely obsessed with music. Years later, that period of poverty would become one of the memories money could never buy back. Aerosmith signed with Columbia Records in 1972. Their first album arrived in 1973, and initially, almost nobody outside Boston seemed to notice. Dream On was released and failed to become an immediate national phenomenon. But Aerosmith kept touring. They opened for other bands, played wherever they could, and slowly built an audience. Then came Get Your Wings, Toys in the Attic, and Rocks. Suddenly, the band that had once struggled to get noticed was selling millions of records. Sweet Emotion, Walk This Way, and Dream On became rock classics. Steven Tyler transformed into something larger than a singer. He became a symbol of rock and roll itself. Asterisk on stage, Tyler appeared almost indestructible. He jumped, spun, screamed, danced, and turned the microphone stand into part of the performance. His scarves became instantly recognizable. His voice could move from a whisper to a scream within seconds. Fans called him the Demon of Screaming, and the nickname fit the image perfectly. But there was another side to that success. Stephen and Joe Perry were becoming deeply dependent on drugs. Heroin, cocaine, alcohol, and other substances became part of the band's lifestyle. The two were eventually known as the Toxic Twins. The same chemistry that helped create some of Aerosmith's greatest music was also destroying the people making it. The late 1970s became increasingly chaotic. Arguments, drug use, exhaustion, and personal conflicts began tearing the band apart. Joe Perry eventually left Aerosmith in 1979. Brad Whitford followed later. Stephen was devastated, but addiction had changed the way he saw the world. The band continued with different musicians, but the magic was disappearing. Rock, in a Hard Place, arrived in 1982, but Aerosmith was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Stephen's performances became unreliable. The band struggled commercially. The industry that had once celebrated them began to assume that their best days were over. Then came rehab. Stephen entered treatment in the 1980s, but at first he did not fully understand why he was there. He returned again, and the battle continued. Eventually, Joe Perry and Brad Whitford returned, restoring the classic Aerosmith lineup. But reunion alone could not save the band. Stephen needed to confront something much deeper: the belief that drugs were necessary for his creativity. For years, he had convinced himself that heroin helped him write and cocaine helped him perform. The idea that sobriety might make him less creative terrified him, but the opposite would eventually prove true. In 1986, Aerosmith's collaboration with Run DMC changed music history. Walk This Way introduced Aerosmith's classic rock sound to an entirely new generation through hip-hop. The famous video symbolized a wall being broken down between two musical worlds. Suddenly, Aerosmith was relevant again. The band that had seemed finished was back in the cultural conversation. In 1988, Stephen entered rehab again following an intervention involving the band. This time, something was different. Sobriety became more than a temporary pause. It became the foundation of a second career. Stephen eventually discovered that he could create music without destroying himself to make it. The comeback was extraordinary. Permanent Vacation helped restore Aerosmith's commercial power. Pump pushed them even higher. Janie's Got a Gun became one of the band's most serious songs and earned them a Grammy. Then came Get a Grip, followed by another wave of massive hits. Aerosmith was no longer simply a surviving 1970s rock band. They had become a cross-generational phenomenon. Their music videos dominated MTV, and Steven Tyler became recognizable even to people who had never attended a rock concert. The man who had nearly destroyed his career was now standing at the top of the music industry again. Then came one of the most emotional moments of Steven Tyler's career. In 1998, Aerosmith recorded I Don't Want to Miss a Thing for the movie Armageddon. The song became the band's first #1 hit on the Billboard, Hot Ka Saratus. But behind the success was something deeply personal. Steven's daughter, Liv Tyler, appeared in the film. 4 years. Liv had grown up believing another man was her father because Steven's addiction had kept him away during much of her early childhood. When she eventually learned the truth, father and daughter slowly began building a relationship. Suddenly, Steven was singing about never wanting to miss a moment while standing in a recording studio, connected to a daughter whose childhood he had, in reality, missed. That contradiction followed Steven for years. He had achieved everything millions of people dream about, but success could not give him back lost time. He had 4 children with 3 women, and his family life was complicated by addiction, divorce, absence, and grief. His relationship with Liv eventually became much stronger, but repairing a family is not like repairing a broken guitar string. It takes time. It requires honesty, patience, and repeated effort. Steven's recovery forced him to confront the people he had hurt and the years he could never recover. Aerosmith was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. By then, Steven had already survived one of the greatest musical comebacks in history. But sobriety was never a guarantee that the rest of his life would become easy. health problems began appearing. Years of performing, injuries, and physical strain started taking a toll. He developed medical problems requiring treatment, including hepatitis C, which he later publicly discussed. Treatment itself was difficult, and his marriage to Teresa Barrick eventually ended. Once again, Stephen found himself dealing with loss while trying to maintain his career. In 2006, Stephen suffered a vocal cord injury that required surgery. For a singer whose entire identity was built around his voice, it was a frightening warning. Yet, he returned to the stage. Then, in 2009, he fell from the stage during a performance in South Dakota. The injuries forced Aerosmith to cancel shows. Pain medication became part of his recovery, and for someone with a long history of addiction, prescription painkillers were a dangerous complication. Stephen eventually entered rehab again in 2009. His health struggles continued. In 2011, he suffered another fall while in Paraguay and required medical treatment. Around the same period, he entered a completely different chapter of his career by becoming a judge on American Idol. Some rock fans hated the idea. Others enjoyed seeing the larger-than-life performer in a completely different environment. But Stephen seemed determined to keep moving. He released a country-influenced solo album, explored television, and continued performing with Aerosmith. Even when the old version of himself was becoming harder to maintain, he kept searching for another version. Then, in 2022, addiction returned in a painful way. After foot surgery and the use of medication to manage pain, Stephen relapsed and voluntarily entered an inpatient treatment program. Aerosmith canceled several shows. For fans, it was heartbreaking because Stephen had already fought this battle so many times. But for Stephen, perhaps the most important part was recognizing that relapse did not mean the fight was over. He entered treatment and stayed longer than originally planned. The message was simple. Recovery had to come before the stage. In 2023, Aerosmith announced the Peace Out Farewell Tour. After more than 5 decades, the band wanted to give fans one final opportunity to see them together. Tickets sold, expectations were enormous, and the idea of saying goodbye felt almost impossible. Steven Tyler had spent his entire adult life on stages around the world. Nobody wanted to imagine Aerosmith without him. But after the first shows, something happened that nobody could simply fix with determination. Stephen suffered a serious laryngeal injury that damaged his ability to sing. The injury became the turning point of his career. The voice that had survived decades of screaming, touring, illness, addiction, injuries, and exhaustion could no longer function as it once had. The farewell tour was postponed while Stephen attempted to recover. Doctors and specialists worked with him, and he reportedly put enormous effort into rehabilitation. But the hoped-for full recovery never came. In August 2024, Aerosmith announced that the band would retire from touring because Stephen's vocal injury made a full return impossible. After more than 50 years, the road had come to an end. For Steven Tyler, the silence must have been especially strange. Imagine spending decades surrounded by amplifiers, drums, screaming crowds, backstage noise, and the constant pressure of performance, and then suddenly being told that your voice cannot do what it once did. The microphone that had always represented freedom now represented something he could no longer fully control. The scarves could still hang from the stand. The stage could still be illuminated. The audience could still be waiting. But the sound that had defined the entire experience was different. There is another deeply controversial chapter that cannot simply be ignored. In the 2020s, Julia Hope, who had been a teenager when she became involved with Tyler in the 1970s, filed a lawsuit alleging sexual assault and other misconduct. A second woman, Jean Bellino, later filed another lawsuit involving allegations concerning events from the same decade. Tyler denied the allegations. The legal claims and their details remain matters for the courts and public record. Not something that should be presented as proven guilt, but the allegations have inevitably complicated his legacy, particularly because aspects of the relationship with Holcomb had previously been discussed in Tyler's own memoir. That contradiction is uncomfortable but important. Steven Tyler can be celebrated for transforming rock music, while still being held accountable for allegations concerning his personal behavior. Great music does not erase serious accusations, and accusations alone should not be treated as court verdicts. His legacy therefore cannot be reduced to either extreme. He was a revolutionary performer and songwriter, a man who survived extraordinary addiction and rebuilt his career, but also a deeply complicated person whose personal history contains painful and controversial chapters. The honest story is not perfectly clean. It never was. There is another contradiction in Stephen's later life. He founded Janie's Fund, an organization supporting girls who have experienced abuse and neglect. The charity's name comes from Janie's Got a Gun, the Aerosmith song about an abused girl. His involvement in helping vulnerable young people is meaningful to many supporters, yet it exists alongside the allegations that have been made against him. Whether someone sees that as redemption, contradiction, or something more complicated depends on how they interpret the evidence and his actions. A person's life is rarely a straight line from good to bad. Sometimes it is a collection of choices, mistakes, attempts to repair damage, and consequences that never completely disappear. Even after Aerosmith retired from touring, Steven Tyler did not completely disappear from the stage. He made occasional appearances and performed when his condition allowed. The voice was no longer the unstoppable instrument audiences remembered from the 1970s and 1980s, but there was still something powerful about seeing him stand behind a microphone. At this stage, the audience was not necessarily demanding perfection. They were witnessing history. They were seeing a man who had spent more than half a century giving everything he had to music, now confronting the limits of his own body. Steven Tyler's story, therefore, cannot end with a simple sentence, like the rock star lost his voice. That would be too small for a life this complicated. He was the boy from New York who wanted freedom, the teenager who discovered rock and roll, the frontman who helped turn Aerosmith into a global phenomenon, the addict who nearly destroyed himself, the survivor who rebuilt his career, the father who spent years trying to repair lost relationships, the performer who kept returning after every setback, and finally, the aging musician forced to confront silence. His voice may never again shake a stadium the way it once did, but the sound he created will remain. The greatest irony may be that after spending a lifetime screaming so the world would listen, Steven Tyler is now remembered, even in silence. The stage may be darker, the microphone may be quieter, and the future may look very different from the one he imagined as a teenager. But the music remains, the memories remain, the contradictions remain. And perhaps that is the real story of Steven Tyler. Not a perfect rock god, and not simply a tragic figure, but a deeply complicated human being who spent more than 50 years trying to outrun his past while leaving behind a sound that the world will not easily forget. So when you think of Steven Tyler, what comes to mind first? The scream, the scarves, Aerosmith, the songs, or the complicated man behind the microphone? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if this story made you see the legend differently, subscribe for more stories about the lives behind the world's greatest icons.